I'd like to share with you some of my experiences, how BVD can affect your operation, whatever that might be. I'll give you a little bit of my background. My family has been in the cattle business since I can remember. After getting out of school, I have a degree in animal science from Purdue, and I worked very closely with the beef unit there. I was assistant herdsman, and so cattle's been a part of my life as long as I can remember. My husband and I started a backgrounding operation in south central Kentucky, and we've always had a few mama cows as well. We're now branched. I've been working with Gold Standard Labs approximately 6 years. So the combination of the producer side plus the lab, and I wish now that I could as I look back on my history of doctoring cattle and spending as much time with cattle as we have, that I'd known about BVD a long time ago. It would sure have made our life a lot easier. But I'd like for you to think about what BVD is and how it can affect you. I think it's different in everyone's situation, and it's easy in some of our situations to maybe think of it as it's not something that affects you, when indeed it actually affects every one of us in the industry. It is a complex virus. It's a pestivirus. There are 2 types, and I think that in itself leads to some inconsistencies in perception of how it affects animals. Some animals shed higher than others, and there's just lots of variances, but the disease itself is very detrimental to the industry. It's a highly contagious immunosuppressant. That in itself is the biggest problem I see with the disease. Anytime an animal's immune system is compromised, it sets him up for something else, and that may be whatever. It's the leading cause of respiratory disease in confined cattle. And as we are trying to feed more people with less animals and less land, we are unfortunately confining those animals closer. So I think that proliferates this particular problem. It's the single most costly disease in the cattle industry, and that's across the board, whether you're a cow, calf, beef, dairy, stocker. It affects all cattle of all ages, herd sizes worldwide. It has a variety of effects and causes multiple health issues, including negative impact on reproduction, reduced milk production, lower immunity to other viruses, reduced growth rates, respiratory complications, and GI tracts. So when you look at that broad spectrum of things that it can cause, that, again, covers a lot of bases and makes me think that we may make excuses in our situation thinking BVD is not actually the problem, when indeed it surely can be. The transmission is very unique in that it's a pretty broad spectrum. It can occur between cattle from a mother to the fetus in any body fluid. And that would be mucus, urine, feces, tears, any body fluid. So you think about that, injection sites, running cattle through the chute. There's any number of ways it can be transmitted, fence line contact. So when it can occur when an animal enters an area that was infected or was occupied by an animal that was infected. So you think about the prevalence of BVD may be very small, but that one animal, how many animals it can affect, is tremendous. So if just there's been one animal through the chute that has BVD, or been even acutely or PI, persistently infected, it can affect many animals after that. I mentioned that it's the #1 cause of respiratory disease in cattle. This study was done a few years ago, so I'd hate to think what that number would be now, but $2 billion per year for the industry is tremendous. We need to recognize that this isn't a small deal, and we need to, do what we can to overcome this. There's a lot of money there on the table that we need to be doing something with. This virus spreads very rapidly, if not contained or detected. increases the instances of disease in your herd, reduces growth rates, causes weaker newborns, abortions during early to mid-gestation, increased mortality rate, and antibiotics are going to have only a limited effect. I mentioned that there's the PI and TI. There are actually two variations of the BVD virus. I want to talk to you a little bit about the transiently infected animals. Can be as detrimental as the positive, but they're much smaller incidents, I guess. If you have a positive, then you're going to have TI animals around him. An animal who is transiently infected has been exposed to BVD virus. So he is going to shed for a period of time, and that acute infection, like a URI with a cold, may last 6 to 12 days. That amount of viral shed is 1 to 10,000 viral particles for that 6 to 12 days. A persistently infected animal, on the other hand, is 1 to 10 million viral particles every single day of his life, in a very small amount of that body secretion that we talked about earlier. So you can see that one animal can affect several very quickly. That making the PI animal the root of the concern here. Animals that contract the virus postpartum are known as the TI. They will exhibit common symptoms including weakened immune systems, respiratory infections, and possibly diarrhea. The name itself is kind of a misnomer, unfortunately, and everyone thinks if they don't have diarrhea or they're not seeing diarrhea that BVD is not the issue. And that's actually the farthest from the truth. I can tell you in our situation, diarrhea is probably the last thing that we see, if we even do see it at all. Generally, those animals are going to recover in 12 to 14 days, especially if they're removed from the source of the infection, that being the PI animal. They will build antibodies against future BVD infections. The persistently infected animal contracted the virus in utero. So they were born that way, they will die that way. There's nothing you can do to change that status. They may appear normal, but they do rarely reach maturity. They are lifelong carriers of the virus at the tremendous shed rate that I mentioned, 1 to 10 million viral particles every single day. I mentioned also that they're born a PI, they're going to die a PI. If they do reach reproductive status, they will always produce a PI animal. They're not easily identified, and that is probably the worst case scenario in this situation. You know, if you can't look at something and say, I've got a problem, then you tend to ignore it. And unfortunately, in our situation, when we do identify those positive animals, compared to their herd mates, they may look like they're perfectly fine. And that's a tough thing to do, is to remove this animal that looks perfectly fine and, remove him from the herd and take quite a loss getting him out of the situation. A third of the animals, PI animals, may actually die before they're 500 pounds. So we tend to see a higher prevalence in lighter weights. I would say, across the population it's 4 per 1,000. But if you're testing animals that are under 350 pounds, it may be as many as 10 per 1,000. And that's something that we've seen in our operation. We background a lot of cattle, and we have seen, we put in a lot of 350 weight, high-risk sale barn cattle. We have seen as many as 10, 11 per 1,000. That's a pretty big hit. But we have recognized the value of removing those animals from our herd mates. The high-risk animals in themselves is one situation, but you put a PI in that situation as well, and you've got something waiting for the perfect storm to blow up. And a lot of times that can be brought on by additional stress, whether it's weather or maybe they were weaned on diesel fuel going to the sale barn. So those are a lot of things that come into play here. But if that animal that is exposed, or that group of animals is exposed to the PI animal, you're already headed the wrong way. Vaccinating or giving antibiotics is not very effective as long as that PI is in there. Vaccinating prior, there is a place for the vaccination, but if you already are in the situation of being exposed to the PI, that vaccination is not going to make the problems go away. This is just a we've done this several times at our operation. We have a PI pin. Anytime we have an animal that's positive, we pull them out and put them in a pin that we kind of designated as such. We've got a 30-foot boundary around that pin. We try not to go in there unless we're dragging out deads. The feed truck drives by and, we go in there and pull. We are actually selling them as slaughter animals. But I'm going to tell you right now, it's not a win situation. We mark them back at 250 cents a hundred going into that pen, and over the last 3 years, I can tell you they're still losing money. You may have them ready to slaughter, and you go in there to haul one in. You've got an appointment, and go in there to pull him out, and he's dead. It's just the nature of the beast. There's no rhyme or reason to it. I think it has something to do with the different types of BVD that are being shed, and as we introduce new animals to the pen, sometimes they are not protected against different strains. So we may have one that's ready to slaughter, and then we brought in a new smaller animal that's a different type, and that's all it takes to take care of it. So anyway, we do this where we've had animals on the trailer at different field days, and we'll ask producers, which one do you think's the PI? Well, these cattle look perfectly healthy, but indeed these are all persistently infected animals. So that's a huge thing to get past, is not being able to visually recognize them and identify that problem visually. The risk of initial treatment for respiratory disease was 43% greater in cattle exposed to a PI animal compared to those not exposed. What we've tried to do in our operation is, if we just test everything coming in, recognizing that we may or may not have one, but if we do have one, the benefits of removing them, even though they have been exposed, the benefits of removing him as quickly as possible is still going to help us greatly. This study was done by Guy Lonergan, and it's also a little outdated. I struggle with, we need current information with better numbers. I think the testing has kind of moved from the larger feedlot growing areas in the west back to the southeast, more to the smaller producers, the cow-calf, it needs to be done at the cow-calf situation. That's where we need to find that animal. It's the most economical time to remove him from the herd. But I think it's brought with it, a whole different set of numbers, and I would sure like to see some updated data. We'll just kind of go through some symptoms that you might see in a stalker operation. I mentioned the health breaks or wrecks, and believe me, I've seen enough of those over the last 30 years that I really do wish I had known about BVD a long time ago. I can tell you in our situation, we started keeping records. We're pretty standardized, or we try to be very, records come a top priority to us in our operation, because if you don't know where you are, then you don't know if you're doing, if you're gaining any ground or not. So for 3 years we kept records of the animals that had a PI in that pen, and we compared to the previous year's records where we did not test, and the numbers just literally jumped off the page at us. The chronics went away on the animals where we were removing the persistently infected. We were doctoring less. When we did doctor, those animals responded much better, and we were getting away from second and third treatments. Many times if we are doctoring, that's all we're needing to do. Or before, we were doctoring 3 or 4 times, and we would commingle cattle, build to larger pen size. We'd start them in a 100 size group and then grow to bigger sizes, bigger pens, heads, and as we would do that commingling effect, they would blow up again. And if you understand, 4 weeks into the feeding period and you're having a blow up, it's very detrimental. So, the higher incidence of chronics, I managed those. That kind of went away once we started the testing. Our mortality rate dropped considerably. Our death loss, we were running, I mentioned high-risk sale barn cattle. We were running 3 to 4%. We're down to just a tick over 1 now, and we'll run about 8,000 to 10,000 a year. So we've got some good numbers to work with. One of the other things you might see in a stock operation is sudden pen deads, and we would see those and not have a clue what we would find, what might have caused that. And sometimes even posting those animals, if we weren't looking for the right thing, we weren't even identifying as BVD as the source. We were kind of going through the steps, but we didn't have the right information. In a cow-calf operation, I think it's a little harder to identify symptoms, mainly due to the nature of BVD. Suppressing the immune system opens it up for a various, variety of different things, and one of those could be higher expected rate of open cows, and we may put that off on, well, it's kind of droughty last year. Maybe my nutrition wasn't what it should have been, so maybe that's the issue. Abortions, premature or deformed calves. Sometimes we're going to blame our mineral, or there's lots of different ways to look at it, and unfortunately I think we want to look for something besides the obvious. Increased calf health issues. All of these are symptoms of BVD, but they're also symptoms of lots of things that we see every day. So I think for the hardest sell for me has been talking to the cow-calf people and trying to make them recognize that BVD could be indeed causing some of these issues. The term closed herd comes up a lot. When it does, it makes me cringe a little bit, because I don't know that any of us truly have a closed herd. You think about what that term means, and if you would have to not buy any replacement heifers or bring any bulls in or never graft a calf onto a cow that lost her calf. There's lots of ways that we bring exposure in without really thinking of it as exposure. Maybe your neighbor runs some stalkers and you have fence line contact with his stalker animals. In that situation, if the biggest thing as a cow-calf producer I think you want to keep in mind is protecting those mamas during early gestation from whatever that source may be. We'll talk about some of the impacts. 5% in conception rates. An estimated 10% in weaning weights. With today's prices and input costs, this is huge. What can we do about BVD in our individual operations? The biosecurity I mentioned briefly on the cow-calf situation. Just be careful once you think about what you have, protecting those animals during that critical time. If you do bring in new animals, make sure that you're testing and then quarantining them and make sure if they are even, maybe they're not a positive, but they may have been exposed and they're transiently infected, make sure that that virus has had time to clear their system before you expose the rest of your herd. Vaccinations are huge. There's a lot of good vaccines out there now. Timing is of the utmost importance on your vaccinations. There's no vaccine that's 100%. We all would like to think they are, but read your labels, talk to your healthcare professional, your veterinarian. Make sure that the vaccine you're using is doing the job that you think it is. And diagnostics. We've come a long way with our diagnostics. There are lots of different available technology. So there's really not a reason that you can't protect yourself from BVD. Identify your security weak points. I mentioned the replacements, bulls. That's the last thing that people in a cow-calf situation think about is their bulls. And I've actually had 3 producers since I've been at the lab in 6 years that bought positive, mature breeding animals. It took nearly 3 years to get their situations cleaned up. So think about that and don't make any assumptions when you purchase that animal. I mean, you don't make an assumption when you buy a car, you get the Carfax. Let's get the facts on the bull. On your replacement heifers, make sure that they've been tested. And then, make sure that you're protecting yourself from your fence lines, especially during that critical time. That critical time being 40 to 150 days in gestation. So just think about trying to keep those animals protected the best way you can. If you're in the purebred business and you're you're taking animals to sales and you bring something back, if you're showing, all these are ways that we can be bringing something back home to our animals. Just keep them separate and protect them. Even stock trailers, you know, you borrow your neighbor's trailer, he may have hauled something to the stockyards or brought something home from the stockyards, and you got to borrow his trailer to haul a cow to the vet, whatever. These seem very minor, but we overlook these minor points, and those are the ones that cost us the most. I mentioned it can't be visually detected. Believe me, I've had some producers tell me, oh, I know that one is. Be sure and check number what's, you know, so-and-so. I'm sure he doesn't look right. And unfortunately, the ones that we think don't look right are not the positive animals. So testing can detect those animals, and I mentioned we've got a lot of different options as far as technology as far as testing. We've got state labs, we have independent labs, your veterinarians have different sources. It's not an insurmountable task to go through and test your animals. In a cow-calf situation, I would recommend testing your calf crop first, and then any animal that you might not have a calf to represent. So that would be any open animals and bulls. The diagnostic tools is the best way to protect your herd. If you know what you've got, then you can go forward. I mentioned testing all calves, all open animals. And the stocker backgrounder situation, especially if you're buying high-risk animals, this is just something we've added to our protocol. It's $3.50. You can't buy an antibiotic shot for that nowadays. It's been a good investment for us. I would recommend, visit with, check out your sources and see what you have available to you. I mentioned new animals. If you introduce them, test and quarantine for at least 21 days. The reason we want to test is to eliminate that infection vector, lower your herd health cost. Everybody wants lower cost, decrease death loss. That's more money in the pocket. Prohibit BVD-induced reproductive issues, whether that's conception rates or dummy calves or abnormalities. There's lots of different ways that we might have issues. Conception rates are often affected the most. I had a gentleman growing some heifers, and I think there were about 1,500 head that he also ran some stocker animals. Everything was done right. The protocol was perfect as far as the nutrition, the mineral, but when we preg checked the animals, we only had 43% bred. We checked the bulls, everything was fine. So my first question was to him was, were these animals PI tested when you brought them in? And no, they were not. So we went back through and tested them. We did find 2 positives. I cannot explain this, but where those positives were was not actually the pen with the lowest conception rates. It was the adjoining pens. It doesn't make much sense, but the source was there. It affected it tremendously. Those animals could have been worth $3,000 a head, were worth $1,700, $1,800. So there's a tremendous benefit there to knowing what you have before you step into a venture like that. The confirmed PI negative animals can recognize added value, and that's something that we've done at Gold Standard Labs. We've collected some data with Superior Livestock over the last 3 years that has actually shown us that those animals can be worth as much as $14 a head more because they've been PI tested. People are starting to recognize the value. It's almost a predictability figured into that animal's performance. If PVD is not part of his background or a part of his makeup, then you know what you have and you can go forward. Ethically, or peace of mind, I think it's important to know what you have as a producer and represent that to the next person down the line, whether you're cow, calf, stocker. I mentioned predictability. That's something we try to build into the cattle that we background in our operation. And then the guy on the other end is extremely happy with the performance and he comes back wanting more. Once you remove the persistently infected animals, it changes your whole scheme of things as far as the performance. This is what it's all about. This is a really nice heifer and baby calf. It's money in the pocket. Makes you feel good looking at this. knowing that BVD is not part of your operation also makes you feel good. It makes your pocket feel better. There's just lots of ways that we need to think about as we produce more product with less animals, less resources. Think about that consumer. We want to use less antibiotics if possible, so reduce your health risk. At Gold Standard Labs, we do a pooled PCR. It's a USDA licensed test, and we have same-day turnaround. So we've trying to take a lot of the reasons why not to test out of the picture. We also offer reduced shipping rates. So it's pretty simple. You call us, tell us how many supplies you need. We send those to you. You collect the sample, and using our return labels, drop it back in the mail. And then later that day or the next day, first thing, you're going to know what you've got. Then, if you have a group of cattle that are identified as PI negative, be sure to represent them that way to whoever you're sending them to next, because there is some added value there. So that's what I want you all to think about is, added value on the animals that we are producing. And let's I think education, that's the biggest thing for me, is educating producers how BVD can affect them and what some of the symptoms might be, and indeed, even if it's not a part of your operation, let's make sure that you represent that to the next person down the line. And I think there's more and more recognition that it is a problem, and it's definitely becoming. There's just a lot of questions out there, so don't get caught up or get bogged down in the questions or the discrepancies about tests or the confusion. Seek out those professionals and learn about it. They're there to help you, and I hope that I've been able to pass on a little bit of my experience, what BVD is, what it can mean to you in your operation.